Jake Morrison had never imagined that a 100-year-old oak tree would become the center of his biggest battle with the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. The massive tree stood majestically on the property line between his backyard. In the common area maintained by the HOA, its sprawling branches had provided shade for generations of families, and its thick trunk bore the carved initials of countless couples who had found romance beneath its canopy. The trouble began on a sweltering Tuesday morning in July, when Jake received a certified letter from the HOA board. The letter was signed by Patricia Wells, the association president, and it outlined a series of complaints about the oak tree. According to the document, the tree posed multiple violations of the community covenants. The branches allegedly extended too far into the common area, creating liability issues for the association. Falling leaves were described as a maintenance burden that increased landscaping costs for all residents. Most concerning to Jake is the claim that the root system was damaging underground utilities and potentially affecting property values throughout the neighborhood. Jake read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. The HOA was demanding that he either trim the tree back to their specifications or remove it entirely at his own expense. The proposed trimming would require cutting away nearly 60% of the tree, including all the branches that provided shade to his backyard patio where his family spent countless summer evenings. The alternative of complete removal was even more devastating to consider. Patricia Wells had been HOA president for 7 years and was known throughout Willowbrook Estates for her strict interpretation of community rules. She lived in the largest house at the end of Maple Drive and maintained her own property with military precision. Her lawn was always perfectly manicured, her flower beds were geometrically arranged, and her house exterior was painted in the exact shade of beige specified in the association guidelines. Patricia viewed any deviation from established standards as a personal affront to the community she worked so hard to maintain. The oak tree had been a source of irritation for Patricia since she first moved to the neighborhood. She considered it an eyesore that disrupted the clean lines of the common area landscaping. The natural randomness of fallen leaves conflicted with her vision of a pristine suburban environment where every element was controlled and maintained, according to predetermined standards. When several residents complained about the mess during the previous autumn, Patricia saw an opportunity to address what she viewed as a long-standing problem. Jake decided to fight the HOA demand. He hired Tom Bradley, a local arborist, to conduct a professional assessment of the oak tree. Tom had been working with trees for over 20 years, and his report contradicted nearly every claim made by the HOA. The tree was healthy, with no signs of disease or structural weakness. The root system showed no evidence of utility line damage and actually helped prevent soil erosion in the area. The branches extending into the common space were well within normal limits for a tree of that age and size. Armed with the arborist report, Jake attended the next HOA board meeting to present his case. The meeting was held in the community center conference room, where 5 board members sat behind a long table facing rows of metal folding chairs. About 15 residents were in attendance, most of them there to discuss routine matters like pool maintenance and holiday decorating guidelines. When Jake stood to speak, Patricia Wells looked at him with barely concealed annoyance. He presented Tom Bradley's findings and argued that the tree posed no legitimate threat to the community. He pointed out that the oak had been there long before any of the houses were built, and that it was actually a valuable asset that enhanced property values rather than diminishing them. Several other residents spoke in support of keeping the tree, including elderly couple Bill and Martha Henderson, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. Despite the evidence and community support, the board voted 4-1 to uphold their original demand. Board member David Kim cast the sole dissenting vote, arguing that the tree was part of the neighborhood's character and charm. The other members sided with Patricia, citing their responsibility to minimize its liability and maintenance costs for the association. Jake left the meeting frustrated but not defeated. Spent the following weeks researching HOA law and community covenant interpretation. He discovered that the property line surveys from when the neighborhood was originally developed showed the oak tree was actually located entirely on his property rather than straddling the boundary as the HOA claimed. Potentially invalidate their authority to demand tree removal or modification. The legal research led Jake to contact attorney Lisa Chang, who specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. Lisa reviewed the case documents and confirmed that the survey discrepancy created a strong defense against the HOA demands. However, she warned that fighting the association would be expensive and time-consuming, even with a solid legal position. The HOA had deeper pockets and could afford to drag out litigation for months or years. Meanwhile, Patricia Wells was growing impatient with Jake's resistance to the board decision. She began documenting every fallen leaf and minor branch that landed in the common area. She took photographs of what she described as damage to the landscaping and sent weekly reports to the property management company that handled HOA enforcement actions. Patricia also started contacting other residents to build support for tree removal by emphasizing potential liability issues and maintenance costs. The conflict escalated when the HOA hired their own arborist to conduct a second assessment of the oak tree. This expert produced a report that contradicted Tom Bradley's findings and supported the association's position that the tree posed multiple risks to the community. Jake suspected that the HOA had shopped around until they found an arborist willing to provide the conclusions they wanted, but he couldn't prove any impropriety in their evaluation process. As autumn approached, the dispute remained unresolved. Jake had filed a formal appeal of the board decision and was preparing for potential legal action if necessary. The oak tree continued to stand majestically in his backyard, seemingly oblivious to the human conflict swirling around its ancient trunk. Neighborhood tensions were rising as residents chose sides in what had become the most contentious HOA dispute in Willowbrook Estates history. Patricia Wells viewed Jake's continued resistance as a challenge to her authority and the entire HOA system. She began preparing for what she saw as a necessary demonstration that community rules would be enforced regardless of individual objections. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have consequences neither side could have anticipated. When the dispute first began, the situation reached a breaking point on a crisp October morning when Jake discovered HOA contractors in his backyard without permission. He had left early for a business trip, assuming the legal proceedings would prevent any immediate action against the tree. His wife, Emma, was visiting her sister in another state, leaving their teenage daughter Megan alone in the house when the work crew arrived. Megan later described hearing chainsaws and looking out her bedroom window to see three men in hard hats cutting branches from the oak tree. She ran outside to confront the workers, but they showed her official-looking documents authorizing the tree trimming on behalf of the HOA. The crew foreman explained that they were following specific instructions to cut back all branches extending beyond the property line as defined in their work order. The problem was that the work order was based on incorrect property line information that the HOA had never corrected despite Jake's survey evidence. The crew began cutting branches that were actually well within Jake's property boundaries. Megan called her father in panic. Jake immediately contacted Lisa Chang and demanded that she obtain an emergency restraining order to stop the tree cutting. Unfortunately, the legal system moved slowly compared to chainsaw work. By the time Lisa reached the court clerk and began filing paperwork, the crew had already removed dozens of major branches from the oak tree. The restraining order came through 3 hours after the work began, but the damage was extensive. 8. Had been a full canopy providing complete shade, was now a lopsided remnant with branches only on one side. The sight that greeted Jake when he returned home that evening was devastating. The oak tree that had been the centerpiece of his backyard looked like it had been split down the middle by lightning. The side facing the common area had been stripped bare, leaving only the trunk and major limbs. The other side remained full and green, creating a bizarre, asymmetrical appearance that defied natural logic. Jake stood in his backyard, staring at the mutilated tree and feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak. The contractors had followed their instructions precisely, but those instructions were based on incorrect information that should have been corrected weeks earlier. The HOA had achieved their goal of reducing maintenance in the common area, but at the cost of destroying a magnificent tree that could never be restored to its original form. Emma returned home, The next day to find Jake sitting on their patio, looking at the half-tree with a expression of stunned disbelief. She had been following the dispute from a distance and hoping for a reasonable resolution that would preserve both the tree and neighborly relations. The sight of the oak tree's unnatural appearance brought her to tears as she realized that years of family memories associated with that shady spot had been permanently altered. The immediate aftermath of the tree cutting brought a flood of neighborhood reaction. Some residents were appalled by the extreme measure taken by the HOA, while others felt vindicated that community rules had finally been enforced. Bill and Martha Henderson stopped by to express their sympathy and anger at what they called a travesty of environmental stewardship. Other neighbors avoided eye contact when they encountered Jake during his morning walks, clearly uncomfortable with the controversy. Patricia Wells issued a statement through the property management company, defending the HOA action as necessary enforcement of community standards. She claimed that Jake's refusal to comply with reasonable requests had forced the association to take direct action to protect all residents' interests. The statement made no mention of the property line error that had led to excessive cutting or any acknowledgement that the tree removal had gone beyond the original trimming plan. Local media picked up the story when Jake contacted the newspaper about what he characterized as HOA overreach and property rights violations. Reporter Mike Thompson interviewed both sides and wrote an article that portrayed the conflict as symptomatic of broader tensions between individual homeowner rights and community association authority. The article included a photograph of the half-tree that struck readers as both tragic and absurd. The newspaper story generated unexpected public interest in Jake's situation. The image of the perfectly bisected oak tree resonated with people who saw it as a symbol of bureaucratic excess and environmental destruction. Social media posts about the half-tree began circulating beyond the local community as the photograph captured attention for its stark visual impact and the story behind it. Meanwhile, Jake was dealing with the practical consequences of the tree cutting. The arborist, Tom Bradley, assessed the damage and delivered sobering news about the oak's future prospects. The severe pruning had removed so much of the tree's photosynthetic capacity that survival was questionable. The remaining branches would be stressed as they tried to compensate for the loss, and the unbalanced weight distribution created structural instability that could lead to storm damage. Lisa Chong was preparing a lawsuit against the HOA for property damage and civil rights violations. The case was strengthened by the clear evidence that the contractors had exceeded their authority by cutting branches that were indisputably on Jake's property. However, the legal process would take months to resolve and couldn't undo the physical damage to the tree. The psychological impact on Jake and his family was harder to quantify, but equally real. The oak tree had been a focal point of their outdoor living space, and its destruction felt like a violation of their home sanctuary. Megan blamed herself for not being able to stop the cutting crew, despite her father's reassurances that she had done everything possible under the circumstances. As winter approached, the half-tree stood as a stark reminder of the conflict that had torn through Willowbrook Estates. The remaining branches looked increasingly fragile. Without their counterparts to provide balance in the overall appearance, it was so unusual that drivers would slow down when passing Jake's house to get a better look at the botanical oddity. What Jake couldn't have anticipated was that the half-tree's bizarre appearance would begin attracting visitors from outside the neighborhood. The social media attention had sparked curiosity among people who made special trips to see the tree that had been cut in half by an HOA. The unusual sight was unlike anything most people had ever encountered, and it became a conversation piece that transcended the original property dispute. The spring following the tree cutting brought an unexpected development that would transform Jake's personal tragedy into a community phenomenon. As warmer weather arrived, the surviving half of the oak tree began producing new growth in a desperate attempt to recover from the severe pruning. The new branches grew more vigorously than normal, creating an even more dramatic contrast between the bare side and the flourishing side. The visual impact was stunning. The tree now appeared to be half dead and half explosively alive, with the boundary between the two sides creating a perfect line down the middle of the trunk. Nature had responded to human intervention in a way that emphasized rather than healed the artificial division. The result was more striking than the immediate aftermath of the cutting had been. Word of the tree's remarkable recovery spread through social media and local news coverage. The story evolved from a simple HOA dispute to a tale of natural resilience. In the face of bureaucratic destruction, people began describing the tree as a symbol of survival and renewal, and the steady stream of visitors too. Willowbrook Estates increased significantly. Jake initially found the attention intrusive and unwelcome. He was still dealing with his anger over the tree cutting and didn't appreciate strangers taking photographs in his backyard. However, he gradually realized that the public interest in his tree was creating pressure on the HOA to acknowledge their mistake and potentially provide some form of compensation for the damage. The increased visibility also brought support from environmental groups and property rights advocates who saw Jake's case as emblematic of larger issues. The Citizens for Responsible Development organization offered to help fund his legal battle against the HOA, while the County Environmental Coalition adopted the half-tree as a symbol for their campaign against unnecessary tree removal in suburban developments. Patricia Wells found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the HOA president responsible for the controversial tree cutting. The negative publicity was affecting property values in Willowbrook Estates as potential buyers questioned whether they wanted to live in a community with such aggressive enforcement policies. Several current residents expressed concerns about their own landscaping choices and wondered what other arbitrary decisions the HOA might make in the future. The property management company that handled HOA operations began distancing themselves from the tree-cutting decision and suggested that the board consider policy changes to prevent similar incidents. They were concerned about liability exposure from the apparent property rights violations and wanted to avoid association with future negative publicity. Jake's lawsuit against the HOA was moving forward through the court system, but the legal process was complicated by questions about exactly what damages could be proven and what remedies would be appropriate. The tree's survival had eliminated some potential claims for compensation, while the ongoing publicity had created new forms of harm and benefit that were difficult to quantify. The half-tree's fame continued to grow. Throughout the summer, as more people discovered the story through word of mouth and social media sharing. Photography enthusiasts were particularly drawn to the dramatic visual contrast, and many considered it one of the most interesting natural subjects in the region. The tree became a popular backdrop for everything from wedding photos to art projects. Emma Morrison initially resented the constant stream of visitors, but gradually warmed to the positive attention their tree was receiving. She began to see the situation as an opportunity to educate people about HOA overreach and environmental protection. When reporters interviewed her, she emphasized that the tree's survival was miraculous, given the trauma it had endured, and that its continued growth represented hope in the face of institutional callousness. Megan Morrison had mixed feelings about her family's sudden local fame. On one hand, she was proud that their tree had become a symbol of resilience and environmental awareness. On the other hand, she missed the privacy they had enjoyed before the cutting incident brought unwanted attention to their home. She learned to appreciate the educational value of their experience and began volunteering with environmental groups that used their story as an example of why tree protection ordinances were needed. The economic impact of the half-tree's popularity was becoming apparent by late summer. Local businesses reported increased traffic from visitors coming to see the famous tree, and several entrepreneurs had started offering guided tours of unusual Willowbrook attractions. With the Morrison Oak as the featured destination, the irony was not lost on Jake that the tree the HOA had wanted to remove for allegedly reducing property values was now generating economic activity for the entire area. Real estate agents began marketing homes in Willowbrook Estates by emphasizing proximity to the famous half-tree, and several properties sold above asking price to buyers who specifically wanted to live near the landmark. The HOA's fears about negative property value impacts had been completely reversed as the unusual tree became a selling point rather than a liability. Patricia Wells faced mounting pressure to resign as HOA president as more residents questioned her judgment and authorizing the tree cutting. A recall petition was circulated seeking her removal from the board, and several candidates announced plans to run against her. Win the upcoming elections on platforms of more reasonable enforcement policies and better communication with homeowners. Legal resolution of Jake's lawsuit came in September, when the HOA's insurance company decided to settle rather than risk a potentially expensive jury verdict. The settlement included financial compensation for property damage and legal fees, as well as a formal apology from the HOA, acknowledging that the tree cutting had exceeded their authority and violated Jake's property rights. More importantly, for the long term, the settlement required the HOA to revise their enforcement policies to include mandatory property line verification before any tree work, and to provide homeowners with adequate notice and opportunity to respond to alleged violations. The changes were designed to prevent future incidents like the one that had destroyed Jake's oak tree. The half-tree story reached a natural conclusion as autumn arrived, and the surviving branches produced a spectacular display of fall colors. The contrast between the bare dead side and the vibrant living side was more dramatic than ever, as red and gold leaves created a stunning backdrop for the countless photographs being taken by visitors. Jake had come to terms with what had happened to his tree and found peace in the knowledge that its bizarre appearance was inspiring people to think more carefully about environmental protection and property rights. The tree that he had fought to save had become something entirely different than what he had intended to preserve, but it was serving an important purpose that transcended his original goals. The final chapter of the half-tree saga was written in December, when the County Tourism Board officially designated the Morrison oak as a natural wonder and installed a small informational plaque explaining the story behind its unusual appearance. The designation brought official recognition to what had become the most photographed tree in the county, and ensured that future generations would understand the circumstances that had created this unique, natural, and human landmark. Jake Morrison never intended to become famous for his tree or to transform a personal property dispute into a community tourist attraction. However, the bizarre sequence of events that began with an HOA complaint letter had created something unprecedented in suburban America. The half-tree stood as a permanent reminder of what could happen when bureaucratic authority clashed with individual rights, and how nature could respond to human interference in ways that no one could have predicted. The oak tree continued to thrive on its surviving side, while the cut side remained a stark monument to the original conflict. Visitors came from across the region to see the tree that had been cut in half by an HOA and to take photographs of what many considered the most unusual natural sight they had ever encountered. The story had evolved far beyond its origins. In a neighborhood dispute to become a symbol of resilience, adaptation, and the unexpected consequences of human decisions on the natural world. Years later, when people asked Jake Morrison about his famous half-tree, he would reflect on how the thing that had ever happened to his property had somehow become the best thing for his community. The tree that the HOA had tried to eliminate as a liability had become Willowbrook Estates, its greatest asset, and a source of pride for residents who had initially been divided by the controversy. The half-tree had taught everyone involved that sometimes the most devastating setbacks could lead to outcomes that no one could have imagined when the conflict first began.